Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at unemployment. So remember, this unit is about measuring economic performance. And one of the macroeconomic goals is to keep unemployment low. You don't want necessarily zero, which we'll actually kind of talk a little bit about today. And you want it to be kind of a stable, right? You don't want it zooming up and down and up and down. So as we get into this, there's a lot of little technical words that we're going to use. And employed and unemployed, these two words, we use them a lot in normal people language, but in economics class, sometimes we use a really specific meaning. And we've kind of talked about that before, like with the word investment does not mean buying stocks and bonds. It means new construction. It means new machinery, right? And just like that, we're going to say this has a very specific meaning, unemployed does. So let's get started. So generally speaking, we can start by saying there's this thing called the total population. And realistically, I'm kind of eliding some important distinctions in how economists think about these ideas. But just to keep it simple, we can kind of divide the population into two groups. We'd say there's a group that's not in the civilian labor force, and then there's a group that is in the civilian labor force. And the original measure of all of this came about actually during World War II, when the British government was trying to figure out how many workers do they have sitting on the sidelines that they can put into factories. And so that's why it's civilian. It doesn't include the military. So in short, the civilian labor force includes people who are 16 and over, who are not institutionalized, which means like in a residential care facility or jail or something along those lines, not in the military or in school full time, and that if they are either working or actively looking for a job. Everybody else goes in the not in the labor force pile. And so what that means is you know, in this group, you have retirees, right? You know, people who are not actively looking for a job and not working. You have people who are institutionalized or the military or folks who are younger. Now, within that, we can calculate something called the labor force participation rate, right? The labor force participation rate. And that is equal to, right, the labor force divided by the total population. And so sometimes you'll see questions that ask, like, what's the labor force participation rate? And what that is just asking is, what's the proportion of the civilian labor force out of the total population? And now realistically, like what happens in the real world is actually this total population is 16 and over people, and it excludes the military and it excludes people who are institutionalized and in residential care facilities and that kind of thing. So what actually the labor force participation rate looks at is a slightly different measure of the total population. But for our purposes, we don't necessarily have to worry too much about that part. Now, I did want to show you some data. You can actually see down here the labor force participation rate for the United States. And I know that's a little hard to see, but generally it starts around, you know, what do we say here, 58% or so in the 1960s. And then we see a steady climb, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s. And that's because women were entering the labor force, right? In the 1970s and particularly in the 1980s. We often think about that as a 1960s phenomena, but this is really the 60s down here. It's really a 70s and 80s phenomena. And there's some arguments that maybe that is actually rooted in wage stagnation, that women had to go to work not because they wanted to be liberated from their housework duties, but I'm sure that that's part of it. But one of the other theories is that they had to, right? That they had to go get a second job to support the main breadwinner, who at the time would have been a male. And so there's also arguments that in some cases the rise of single parent households, right, which become more prevalent in the 70s and 80s, mean that women are often working more. You can see that it peaks at around 67% in the United States throughout the 90s and 2000s. Then we see a steady decline starting with the Great Recession in 2008 all the way to about 2020. And that steady decline is mostly older white men leaving the labor force. And there was a lot of hand wringing about that, because when we talk about not very many people working who are not in the labor force, what that means is that they're not productive, right? So our economy is not producing as much as we could. And think about all we just talked about with productivity. You lose productivity when you have resources that aren't making stuff. Then you can see here, after the pandemic, or the pandemic's ongoing, of course, this huge drop in labor force participation rate, and that it rebounded a little bit, but it's still way lower than it used to be. And that's because right now there's a lot of people who aren't working and who aren't actively looking for a job. And that's a concern, right, about economic productivity. Now, let's go into that civilian labor force a little bit and talk about the two groups within it. There are only two groups. If you're in the civilian labor force, you are either employed or you are unemployed. And actually, it's easiest to define employed first. So you are employed if you are any of these. So we're going to write any. And we're going to say if you worked 1 hour for pay in the last week. In the last week. And I know this box is a little small, but you're not going to get like tested on the really technical stuff, but it might come up, and so I'm going to tell you what they are. Worked 1 hour for pay. So if you worked for 2 or 3 hours part-time in the last week, you are employed. Okay. If you are self-employed, right? Self-employed for pay, that counts, right? So if you worked for yourself, that's fine. If you worked in a family biz for 15 hours, even without pay. So this is kind of basically saying there are some people that don't take a paycheck because they work in a family business. And if you work for 15 hours, then that counts as employed. And if you are just not at work, but have a job. So maybe you're on vacation, right? That's the like vacation one. That's what that one's really kind of referring to. Or maybe you're really sick or something like that. So my sister-in-law is out on maternity leave. She would be a good example if she's still employed, right? Unemployed, you cannot be employed. So that's a really important factor that students often miss. Like if you have any of these being true, you cannot be unemployed. So even if you're currently looking for a job, if you already have one, you're counted as employed. The second prerequisite, so this is both, it's not any, it's both. You have to have actively sought work, looked for work in the last 4 weeks. So what happens if you looked for work 5 weeks ago and then you stopped? You still don't have a job. Well, you're not employed, but you're also not unemployed. You are neither, right? So if you stopped looking in the last 4 weeks, you are no longer actively looking for a job, boop, you went over to the not the labor force column. So these are time sensitive, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a big federal agency, they collect survey data every single day of the week. They collect survey data. They call people and they survey employers and things like that to see how many people are working. And if you get in their survey, that's one of the key questions they ask. Now, we're going to dive a little bit more into this, but an important thing as we look at this number is something called the unemployment rate. So we will say UE rate is equal to, and this is pretty simple, the unemployed divided by the labor force. And so when you hear about like the unemployment rate went up or the unemployment rate went down, that's what they're talking about. They're saying the number of people who are in the unemployed box out of the civilian labor force went up or went down. And so here is it going all the way back to 1947. This is, again, right about World War II is when most of these statistics were created. And you can see that it peaked really here in the early 1980s with a little over 10%. It came back in 2009 in this really nasty recession. That was the worst recession of my lifetime up to that point. and it peaked at about 10%. And that was actually right about when I graduated from college. It was right in the middle of that really nice high spike right there. So I feel for people who have graduated from college in the last few months, because you graduated into the worst labor market in history. And you can see here that it truly was the highest unemployment rate we've ever recorded. And even now, with it going back down, it's still extremely high. Being over 5% or so is considered quite high. And I'll give you some kind of analysis of that in a second. But now let's kind of think about these groups a little bit more detail. Within the unemployed group, there are 3 groups: frictional, structural, and cyclical. We're going to look at those in the next video. But basically, if you're unemployed, you're going to be one of these 3 types of unemployed. That's all that means. If you are employed, there's a possibility that you're what we call a Peter, a part-time for economic reasons. And you'd have to be both of these to be a Peter. It means that you are employed, right? That's kind of in the name and in order to be inside it. But it's also that you would like full-time, but can't get it for economic reasons. So you could imagine if there's like a global economic downturn as a result of a pandemic and restaurants are closed, that there might be quite a few people who are Peters, who are part-time, but they want full-time job, but they can't get it because their employer's not offering it. But the problem is, right, that the unemployment rate wouldn't count them as unemployed because they worked maybe 10 hours a week for pay. And if they did, then they're employed and everything's hunky-dory, right? You know, we can say, look at that, the unemployment rate went way down, except we know that a lot of those people who are still employed are Peters, right? So that's another nuance of this to think about. Now we're going to switch over to the other side and talk about not in the labor force people. Now, there are, in the not in the labor force, there are really kind of two umbrella groups. There's the marginally attached, and then you can see the other arrow that I've created goes all the way down here to just other. So basically, if you're in the marginally attached group, it just means that you're different and from the others, that there's just other reasons why you're not in the labor force. Marginally attached means you'd like a job, and I don't know why I gave you 3 dots here, but you looked in the last year, but not in last 4 weeks. So basically they give you the survey, right? I told you they survey people. If they survey you and they find you're not in the labor force, they then follow up with, would you like a job? And if you say yes, then they follow up with, we know you haven't looked in the last 4 weeks because then you'd be unemployed, but have you looked maybe in the last 6 months or since a year ago? And if you say yes, then you're marginally attached. It means that you're really close to being in the labor force. And that we have a chance of maybe pulling you back in, right? If there was a job that was available for you that fit your skills, you would come back in and you could potentially be employed. So these are kind of considered people who are on the fringes of the labor force. You could imagine that right now in the middle of the pandemic, there are a huge number of people who are marginally attached. It's an enormous number. Within that, right, there is a group called the discouraged. And these are all marginally attached workers, right? So we'd say that, marginally attached. So in other words, these are people who say, I'd like a job and I've looked in the last year, but I stopped looking specifically because of bad job prospects, of poor job prospects. In other words, there weren't any jobs, so they couldn't find any. So that's why they quit looking, right? They quit looking because they're like, there ain't any jobs, nobody's hiring. So if you're an usher, right, in a movie theater, there's probably not a whole lot of movie theaters hiring people right now. And so there's probably a lot of discouraged workers. Now, discouraged workers tells you that these people are very close to being employed and unemployed. Virtually anything could pull them back into the labor force. They're so close, but they just stop looking because the economy doesn't have the right jobs for them. Now, this is I know this is hard to read. So actually what I'm going to do, I'm going to make this a little bigger. We'll see if this works. Move my face out of the way. I hope that I can move my face. This is actually a comparison of some unemployment rates. And so what it is U6, U3, and the unemployment rate for adult Black men. So U3 is actually what we sometimes call the unemployment rate. So when we talked about like the unemployed divided by the labor force, that's this red line. And you can see that since 2010, it's steadily declined from about 10% all the way down to about 3.5%. So it was quite low. In fact, the kind of normal unemployment rate is right about 4 to 5%. So in fact, we were doing really, really well in these last couple of years in terms of unemployment. You can see the unemployment rate for Black men is this green line, and it typically is between 3 and 7 points higher than the overall unemployment rate. And so there are disparities within unemployment, right? If we just say the headline number, it conceals a lot of important information. But then you can see the next one, and again, I'm covering it up, is called U6. And U6 includes all of the Peters, and it includes all of those marginally attached to the labor force people. So in other words, it's the broadest definition of unemployment that we could have. It even includes people who aren't technically unemployed. They're marginally attached or they're Peters because they're employed. But this gives you a different picture, right? It tells you, how's the economy kind of doing, and when we include all these other people. And you can see that, in fact, if you include all the marginally attached and the Peters, the unemployment rate right now is about 12.5%. That's about twice as high as what the official unemployment rate is. So there's millions and millions of people who are in these marginally attached and Peter groups. And that's a useful thing to kind of keep in mind. Okay, so then we'll wrap up with just kind of a quick, let me move my face back, a quick little discussion on kind of some of the issues and the significance of unemployment. As I was kind of alluding to, it's the indicator of ease of finding a job, but it's not a perfect measure. There's lots of measures of how the economy is doing. It can understate or overstate the true level of unemployment because obviously, it doesn't, the official rate, the U3, this one, and by the way, you don't have to know U3 versus U6 and that kind of stuff. It's just technical fun stuff if you geek out on it like I do. But U3 doesn't include discouraged workers or peers. It doesn't reflect demography, right? I just showed you African American men, but there are all kinds of ways you can slice and dice the labor force. You can slice it by educational outcomes as well. And we find that folks who have advanced degrees typically have extremely low unemployment, like 1 to 2%. But people who have only a high school diploma or who have less than a high school diploma typically have much, much higher rates of unemployment. Young people have higher unemployment rates. African Americans, Hispanic people have higher unemployment rates. The last thing that we'll kind of note is that GDP, which we talked about it previously, and unemployment are often linked. That when there's a recession, when GDP goes down, unemployment goes up. And in an expansion, often unemployment goes down. Right? And these two things are kind of linked because you think about it, you're like, if there's more people working, there's more people producing goods and services, and so GDP will go up when unemployment is going down. Right? So unemployment and GDP move opposite each other. So that gets you the basic ideas of employment, unemployment. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about unemployed types of workers. Hopefully this helped you. See you next time.